I am so looking forward to this message. You got to get your notes out. If you haven't downloaded them from the website, or you've just got to dial in today, because we are talking about this topic, thriving in Babylon. Turn to Daniel chapter 1. Now, Thriving in Babylon is the title of a favorite book of mine by Larry Osborne, but it's this idea that it should come as no surprise to us as Christ followers that we're living in an increasingly hostile culture, and specifically hostile to the Judeo-Christian value system that we hold so carefully. And so the problem, or the question is, how do you engage as a Christ follower, as a Christian, when a culture seems to be saying, stop, I don't want to hear anymore, or when the culture is moving from tolerance to the cancel culture, or I'm not sure about this at all. And in fact, these Christianity culture clashes go on more and more as we go through life. And so I believe that this isn't anything new. The timeless principles in the book of Daniel, and we're only going to get to unpack one chapter of it, we can glean those from this book. And in fact, this idea of living in a godless environment, I think, is the primary theme of the book. It's not just a book about prophecy. It's not just a book about integrity. It's not a book where you find your vegetarian Daniel, eating plan. It is a relevant book because it's the template about how Christianity intersects with a culture that is hostile. And so let's jump right in. Look at your notes here. The first point is we see the conquest. God is still in charge, verses 1 and 2. It says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. In other words, they lost the battle. And with that, some of the vessels of the house of the Lord, and he brought all this stuff to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So here's the backstory. God had repeatedly, over and over again, warned Judah, you got to get your act together. Didn't they learn any lessons from 3.5 centuries earlier when the northern kingdom fell in 722 BC to Assyria? And here now Babylon is knocking on their door in 586 BC. And this guy is tough because God says, look we're going to have a purge here, and you better get your act together. But the problem is they just were so prideful. They rejected God's overtures. They didn't listen to the prophets. And God brought down this savagely wicked Babylonian siege to the city, and they ultimately were conquered. They raided the temple. They took all the good stuff. And they took hostage the best and the brightest, including Daniel and his 4 friends, who we'll see in just a moment. And they hauled them off to Babylon to systematically try to brainwash them and convert them. Now, think about it. This isn't Daniel's fault. No fault of his own. He is caught up in this between these 2 warring nations, and he's the guy caught in the middle with his buddies. And so the principle is, no matter what is happening around you, God is still in control. Regardless of the external, remember the eternal. See, think about this. Daniel never complained, he never whined, he never moaned, he never caved in. He knew his God was in ultimate control. And you're going to see this principle carried out throughout the book. He had confidence in God's character. When we combat a culture that oftentimes is hostile to us, we got to have confidence in God's character. Now, Daniel realized that God had allowed it. This is the interesting thing. He knew that God had allowed his country to be conquered by Babylon. And so he saw everything through the lens that God was in charge. He was allowing it. That's a tough pill to swallow because sometimes we wonder, is God really in charge? Now, that doesn't mean that we're just kind of some cosmic puppet. We do have choices to live within God's will, and we're going to see Daniel make some of those choices. And so how about us? How do we believe or give lip service to this idea of God's sovereignty? Do we really believe he's in control? I mean, many of you have just been up in arms about all that's gone on over the last 18 months with COVID and government regulations and all the divisions in the church over politics and vaccines and masks and a host of other topics. But through it all, God is in charge of this postmodern culture that we find ourselves in. So let's look at the command. It's all about systematic indoctrination in verses 3 and 4. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, what a name, the king of the eunuchs, which you don't want to get into that, that's just bad news, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with the knowledge and understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Now, it does remind me of a funny story. Some of you know that Doug Flagg is the chairman of our elder board, and he may or may not have done this, but we're going to go with it. He's in the library at Biola when he was in college, and he sees a group of young ladies over there, and he's eyeing who is now his wife, Sabrina. He thinks, I'm going to impress her. I'm going to just write a note. And he writes a note, and he actually copies Daniel 1:4. Youth without a blemish, good appearance, skillful in wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding and competent to stand. I mean, he just lays it on thick. He writes the note, and he has one of his buddies just kind of walk it over to that other table where the girls are at, and his buddy hands it to Sabrina. Sabrina looks at it, she smiles, she looks at him, she gets out a piece of paper, she writes a note back, and this is so junior high, but they're at Biola, and the bottom line is, she sends a note back with one of her girlfriends over to Doug. Doug is so excited, this is working, and so he looks at it, and he sees that she's quoting Psalm 116:11, and it says, and he looked it up, and in my dismay I said, all men are liars. You see, that verse, I've been wanting to use that story forever. You'll have to ask Doug whether it really happened. Now, some commentators feel that Daniel and his Jewish friends, they could have been as young as 15-year-olds. They could have been in our student ministry, right? What they end up having them do is they enroll in the Royal Babylonian Academy, where they're not only going to be taught 2 new languages, but they're going to be subjected to its curriculum, steeped in Babylonian philosophy, religion, magic, astrology, their science, medicine, just to name a few. And remember, Babylon is where modern-day Iraq is today. And so their strategy is pretty simple. Let's capture the next generation. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar did something what Alexander the Great did many later times. These guys were the nobility. They were smart. They were influencers. If they were TikTok folks, they would have followers, Instagram out the wazoo. The bottom line, no, they probably would have nothing to do with any of those things. But they were good looking. They were top of the class. And he knows that if he really wants to build a lasting empire, he's got to train them, convert them, because they're going to have to go and manage their own people when someday if he wants to keep control of this kingdom. So these guys are being groomed for government positions, and they're being bred so they would influence their countrymen to abandon Jehovah God and ultimately capitulate in their faith. And his plan to brainwash them and to use them as pawns. By the way, that is not a surprise, right? That is not a surprise. We've seen that same thing in the last 40 to 60 years in our own secular university system. There's another great book. I mentioned the first one. Here's another one. It's called The Daniel Code. And I want to read something from this because when did this happen in our country? When did this kind of systematic brainwashing happen? I want to read back to you. I think it began back in 1933 with the Humanist Manifesto, when it sent out its very plain objectives. Let me read. Its stated goal was to bring young people to deny the deity of God and the biblical account of creation. It set out to re-educate young people to the fact that moral values should be self-determined and situational. In other words, there's no absolute truth. We've been dealing with the consequences of that philosophy for many, many years. And so our approach, by the way, shouldn't be any different here in the church. Our student ministry ought to be raising up the best and the brightest as they send them off to college, equipped to know what they believe and why they believe it. And I'm so proud of our youth ministry that Chris and Josh have kind of laid out for us. In fact, here's principle number 2. If you want to stand up to a godless culture, you have to immerse yourself in God's word, not be indoctrinated by the culture. Biblical immersion, not cultural immersion. Well, here's what the king's program was, the concept, a 3-year program, verse 5. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, of the wine that he drank, and they were to be educated for 3 years. That's like a MDiv, a seminary degree. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Now, part of the plan was they're going to get all these special privileges to eat at the king's table, to fatten them up, to entice them, to bribe them to cooperate. The problem is we're going to see that Daniel doesn't want to go with this plan. So they're taken from their homes in Judah. They're transplanted into a new culture. They're given new homes, a new diet, and we're going to see in a moment that's going to become a problem. Now, I don't know if you've ever sat at the king's table. I've never sat at the king's table, but I've sat at the training table for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Years ago, I got to do a pro football chapel, and after I spoke, they invited me to brunch. I am telling you, it was a foodie's dream. And I'm not a foodie, I just like food. The bottom line is, there were thick T-bone steaks, there were all the eggs you could eat. That was so much food, and it was so good, and those guys were so big, and they ate so much. That was an experience. Well, imagine having all that and then throw in the whole wine thing on top of it. So, we've identified that these guys are the next generation. He's going to indoctrinate them, brainwash them, educate them. And the 3-year curriculum is this heavy dose of language acquisition, so they would forget their mother tongue, astrology, demonology, and on and on. They're going to graduate with a master's degree in the occult, essentially. And so you can see the plan was to change their language, to change their literature, to change their lifestyle, and ultimately they're going to change their loyalties. Now, I want to pause here for a moment because Babylon is always a biblical metaphor for all that is wicked and evil. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar was this ruthless, godless, narcissistic, hot-headed, impulsive, murderous egomaniac. How's that for a list of adjectives to describe your leadership style? But I think the one that is so pervasive is he was vain. He was arrogant. Later on he builds this 90-foot statue and says everybody's got to bow down to it. And we think we have it tough. It does remind me of this impulsivity that Nebuchadnezzar has. It kind of reminds me of this story of this kind of hot-tempered, kind of impulsive CEO. This company has a shakeup. They bring in this new CEO, and he gets a tour of the facilities, and he knows he's got to shake things up, and he sees this room full of workers kind of standing around, and he's going to show them that he means business. And so he walks up to this guy and says, "Hey, how much money do you make a week?" The young guy is kind of surprised, kind of looks around sheepishly, and says, "Well, I make $300 a week." "Why?" Well, the CEO then, dishes out 12 $100 bills. Here's your severance pay for a month. Now get out and don't come back. So he's looking around like, I've made my statement, right? And so he looks around. He pulls one of his aides to the side and says, "Hey, what did that guy do anyway? He was just standing around." And his aide just kind of looked sheepishly and looked down without giving me any eye contact. He says, "Yeah, he was the pizza delivery guy at Domino's." You see, Nebuchadnezzar was kind of that impulsive kind of guy, hot-headed to the nth degree, which you would see later in this book. Well, who are these candidates that are going to be indoctrinated? Who are the 4 dudes? Look at verses 6 and 7. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. Remember, that's the messianic line. And the chief of the eunuchs, here he is again, gave them names. They changed their names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Which, by the way, we seem to remember those names. We don't remember their Israeli names or their Jewish names. In fact, my parents, when we told me that story and they put me to bed as a kid, and we got to Abednego, they changed it to you go. Bad joke, I get it. But the bottom line is they changed their names so they would forget their spiritual heritage. It was part of their Forget Who You Are campaign. By the way, here's a principle. You can never forget who you are if you're going to stand for God. Don't let anybody rip that out of you. You know who you are. Remember who you are. And so their name change is very interesting because each of those other names were rooted in Yahweh, this monotheistic God that they believed, not this polytheistic set of gods that the Babylonians believed in. And each of their names had a reference to God, either the syllable El, E-L, from Elohim, or Yah, from Yahweh, and their names were meant to remind them that they belong to God. Believer, you belong to God. I belong to God. We are His, and we'd best not forget that. So they needed to kind of blur their past and push them towards this Babylonian way. And this is the last part of the change. Language, literature, lifestyle, and now their loyalties. But names mean something. Names mean something. Daniel means God is my judge, where Belteshazzar is Bel's prince. It was the title of their demonic-inspired god, Marduk. It's like having your son named, go from, you were called Christian to, Satan's prince, right? How about Hananiah? The Lord shows grace, or some say it means beloved of our Lord, to Shadrach, the command of Aku, one of the many Babylonian gods. Mishael, who is like God, to Meshach, who is like Aku. And then Azariah, God is my help, versus Abednego, servant of Nego, another Babylonian god. So what must have felt like for Daniel? He's the kind of a guy that was probably voted most likely to succeed. He came from this high status family. Think of maybe in our recent political era, the Kennedy family from the 60s. He's a handsome dude. He's uber intelligent. For you students who are listening to this, he had a 4.6 grade average, and he took 9 AP classes before he graduated. He was headed to Stanford, MIT, you name it, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, quote unquote. He was devoted to God, never missed a day of synagogue. He had this promising future career in Judah, not in Babylon. And all of this gets turned upside down. He never expected to end up in Babylon. You know what? Some of you have woken up today and said, I didn't expect to be living in Babylon. Now, for some of you, it's very political. It's very much what's going on in our culture. And you're wondering what's going on in the USA. But I think some of you are living in Babylon because you've allowed your mind to believe that God has somehow abandoned you. And so this relationship that turned sour, the career ambition that just never seemed to work out, the prayer request that doesn't get answered, the one who loves you has hurt you deeply, your health is failing miserably, and now you've kind of put yourself into your own Babylon because you wonder if God knows. And worst of all, you wonder if he even cares. You see, Daniel must have thought, my name means God is my justice. He is just. Could you see him asking himself, maybe in the darkness of the night, where's my justice? This is not what I bargained for. And so what I'd like you to reflect on for a moment is when you find yourself in your Babylon, whether literally, quote unquote, maybe in how you feel about our country, or maybe in this world that gets turned upside down and maybe not to your own doing. What day, it's not if day, when that day comes, how will you respond? Well, we'll see how he responds. The whole rest of the chapter, and we'll have to go a little more quickly here, in verses 8 to 21, we'll see the conflict. And he essentially says, I will not concede or I will not compromise. And let's look at the request in verses 8 and 9. So you can see that not only do you have to have confidence in God's character, you have to have courage in your convictions. By the way, those two principles are seen throughout the book. Throughout the book. The request in verses 8 and 9, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him to not defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief eunuch. He resisted. He said no. He took a stand. There's a difference between erosion and earthquakes. He was not going to let this happen to subtly erode his faith. Now, most of you said, of all the things to push back on, how about that demonic curriculum and this astrology course and the 3 years of trying to brainwash him, and he stands up about the food? You got to be kidding me. But catch this, this is important. What is the big deal about food? Because that's something that specifically God's word spoke to him as a young Jewish boy. It's in the word. First of all, this meat offered to Babylonian gods and idols could have felt like he was participating in kind of a form of a worship service. How about the dietary laws from Leviticus and Deuteronomy? That would expressly forbid most of this menu that he was being offered. The Babylonians didn't distinguish between unclean or clean foods, and in fact, they would have been feeding him pork and horse meat. Remember, there's no bacon. There's no bacon in his diet, right? And so that would have been a problem. By the way, there's no kosher vending machines either. No kosher vending machines. Then, when you shared this kind of a meal, there was a thing called implied relationship that took effect when you shared a meal with someone. In fact, according to Eastern tradition, to share a meal meant to commit oneself to a friendship. So we're not exactly told what reason for not wanting to eat the food is, but we know that his plans, he goes vegan, vegan, plant-based whole food. I don't know, maybe not that far. But he's certainly not going to be that hometown buffet kind of guy either. And so the bottom line is he wants vegetables and water. And if you've ever done that, that's quite a feat, all right? So we do know that Daniel is taking a huge risk, right? It's showing courage because he's going to honor God no matter what. And I say that's taking a risk because Nebuchadnezzar, we've seen, he's a hot-headed, impulsive guy. He's not a guy you want to mess around with. Just check out 2 Kings 25. I don't have time to go into it, but the bottom line, he kills his own sons out of bloodthirstiness, right? But Daniel didn't care. He's not going to defile himself. And so there's a couple of principles that we can find from this section. You got to choose your battles carefully, friends. Some of you just like to fight about everything. Choose your battles, you know. Daniel doesn't make a stink about everything. He doesn't make a stink about the name change or his course of study. And then win them over. Don't fight them. Notice he has somehow already endeared himself to the chief of the eunuchs, the head steward, the head guy. He had earned the right to have an audience with him by his good character, work ethic, etc. previous to this. And so we learn one thing. If you're going to stand up to the culture, we're going to win people over not only by the soundness of our arguments, but also by the attractiveness of our lives. A friend of mine, Dave Fassold, gave me that. We will win people over not only by the soundness of our arguments, but by the attractiveness of our lives. You've heard it this way, it's better with honey than vinegar. Are we going to be winsome, or we're going to kind of be warring with people? Well, there's a reluctance of this guy in verse 10. The chief of the eunuchs says to Daniel, hey, I fear that the king who assigned me this food and drink is going to see you, and your condition is not going to be good, and man, that would endanger. And he says, it will endanger my head. He's going to get a headache? No, it means, like, if this doesn't go well, I end up at the guillotine. So the superintendent thinks he's going to get executed if these guys don't get it together, and if they get skinny and get sick, this is a bad deal. So here's what Daniel recommends. Very ingenious in verses 11 to 14. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test yourself for 10 days. Give us the vegetables. Give us our diet. Give us the water. We won't do the wine. We won't do the fatty meats. And then let our appearance compare us, a taste test, and then let's compare. Let's bring us out and see what you see, and then judge accordingly. So really, we tend to either want to fight people or we just capitulate. So I want to give you 4 ways we deal with the culture. You can just compromise, you just capitulate, you just say, we just got to get along, we got to be tolerant of everything, and we just drift away. Or we can condone the culture and accept all these alternative choices that clearly aren't a part of God's word, and we deconstruct our faith. That's not a way to do it. Or we can condemn the culture by yelling louder, accusing wildly, pounding the Bible harder. I don't think that's the way. I think Daniel got it right. Confront it, stand firm, but confront with love, speaking the truth in love, finding common ground, engaging in a winsome dialogue. So he takes the last option. And guess what? The 10 days, it works. Now, think about it. He's given up kind of the training table with steak, filet mignon, steak at Mastro's for this veggie protein shake approach. This is tough, but he does it. Now, here's another little point. If you want to win somebody over and they're not convinced, just say, hey, let's just try it. Don't have to do this forever. Kind of like Josh is saying, hey, just try a life group, for the year, and then we can mix it up if it doesn't work. And so this risk-free trial approach is a pretty good way of doing business with people who are skeptical. I remember when we hired Adrian as our children's director, she's Scott's wife, should you hire a family member, all this, and as a board we talked about, well, let's just make her a temporary interim, and we did that. Let's see what happens after 6 months. By the time we got with 6 months, she had done such a fantastic job. Nobody remembered that she was interim. And in fact, we finally said, hey, we got to just kind of quantify this. And so she became full-time, or she became permanent, and she's been doing that job wonderfully ever since. So what were the results in verses 15 and 16? At the end of 10 days, they were better in appearance and fatter. Now, fatter means healthier, because we see fat and we're like, no, body fat of, 7%. So they meant healthier. And so the steward took away their fine food and gave them vegetables and water. So then comes the commendation, and you see this in verses 17 to 21. And I'll say 2 things. God prepared them, verse 17, and the king promoted them, verses 18 to 21. And for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So here's the bottom line. God supernaturally paved the way because they understood things quicker, they grasped things, they remembered things, they were fluent in the languages. And this God-given empowerment would come to help Daniel later in the book when he has to decide this dream / riddle in later chapters. And so he was ready. They were prepared. Here's the application for us. God is preparing you right now for your next assignment. He was preparing Daniel during those 3 years for these coming assignments, which we won't have a chance to look at. Part B, the king promoted them, verses 18 to 21. At the end of time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the king of the chief of the eunuchs. By the way, he's mentioned in nearly every section. This is quite the player in this chapter. Brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sure he's a little nervous about it because they've been on this 3-year regimen. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none, get that, circle in your Bible, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. All of them, first-round draft picks, so to speak. So think about this. By that time, they passed their oral exams with the king. They are fluent in the language. They converse. They don't need a translator. They immerse themselves in learning that language. It kind of brings me to shame. I've been going to Mexico for 40 years, and I have not learned that language like I should have. But they not only met expectations, they exceed them. Therefore, look at verse 19. They stood before the king. Verse 20, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired them, he found them 10 times better than everybody else. And then there's a little verse that nobody picks up on in verse 21. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. So Nebuchadnezzar declares him the smartest of the bunch. But here's something. With between the end 20 and verse 21, how many years is that? He outlives Nebuchadnezzar. It's over 70 years he's in the king's service. This is unbelievable. And then he goes on to serve King Cyrus, who is the conquering king who conquered Babylon for the Medes and the Persians. He was faithful all those years. Friends, I'm embarking on this new deal in my life. You know about it in a few months. I'm retiring, if I don't really believe in retiring, from full-time service after 43 years of ministry. And that has been one of my dreams, is I want to be faithful. I want to finish well. And we're coming on the home stretch, and you pray with me about that. But here's the deal. God rewarded that faithfulness. That's how Daniel had staying power all those years. And then I want to give a conclusion that you would say, where did you get this from this text? Think about all that they go through, and how did these guys pull it off? How did Daniel and his 3 friends pull it off? Because they relied on one another. They hung together. They were a life group, to steal Josh's term, right? He found a small group of friends, and they study together, they pray together, they go through the furnace literally together. You'd see that in the rest of Daniel. And one in the future, this small group would go on to one day rule together to change the course of an entire nation. So when you live in Babylon and the world is mocking your faith, I can give you the final principle. You're going to survive. No, you're going to thrive if you live in community. We need each other. You need that support system if you're going to thrive in Babylon. You need to do life together with people of like mind if you're going to thrive in Babylon. And if we're going to stand tall, we need each other to thrive in Babylon.